I call the member for Longman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to speak in support of the Families, Housing, Community Service and Indigenous Affairs and Other Legislation Amendment Bill that seeks to introduce legislation that will reintroduce previously applicable criteria for the assessment of eligibility for youth allowance by inter-regional students. Madam Deputy Speaker, prior to the government's changes to the eligibility for youth allowance, it could be assessed in a variety of ways. Students could work part-time for 15 hours a week for 2 years after leaving school. Students could have been out of school for 18 months and have earned at least 75% of the maximum rate of pay under Wage Level A of the Australian Pay and Classification Scale in an 18-month period. And students could work an average of 30 hours per week for 18 months out of 2 years. Now, inter-regional students can only access youth allowance under the third criterion. The only criterion applicable to them is that they must have worked an average of 30 hours per week for 18 months out of 2 years. This change is going to make it so much harder for some regional students to access tertiary education, and fewer students from regional areas are going to be in a position where they can go to university. Madam Deputy Speaker, 30 hours a week is practically a full-time job, and finding full-time work in the regions can be difficult. Many students in regional areas access seasonal employment in the agricultural and tourism sectors, and the government's changes to youth allowance eligibility criteria simply does not take this into account. In addition to these issues associated with the availability of work, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are issues associated with entry into university after 18 months. Many universities do not accept deferrals for periods longer than 12 months. If any more time is needed, students are required to reapply for a place in the university course of their choice. Eligibility criteria for courses change, Madam Deputy Speaker, and whilst you may get into your chosen course 1 year, there is no guarantee that this will be the case 2 years later. In addition, the longer students defer, the less likely they are to pursue tertiary study. It is already the case that over 20% more students from metropolitan areas go to university than regional students. Instead of attempting to facilitate access for regional students and narrow this gap, the changes to youth allowance will only make it more difficult for these young people. Madam Deputy Speaker, not only are there costs of studying incurred by having to move away from home to pursue study, there are also significant reallocation costs to be met as well, estimated as being in the vicinity of up to $20,000. This is a further significant barrier to regional students wanting to go on to tertiary study. Madam Deputy Speaker, unrestricted access to further education is vitally important for our nation. Further education and the attainment of skills will improve productivity and will make Australia more competitive. Many regional areas rely on their young people to return to the regions to work after they have completed their study. For example, medical professionals are very difficult to source in the regions. A witness to the Senate inquiry made 2 points. Firstly, that the government should make it easier for regional students to access university in the hope that some may return to share their expertise with their communities, and that professional people living in the regions should not feel forced to move because their children cannot receive the education they want. It is important that all young people, regardless of where they live, are able to pursue further education if that is what they want to do. The government's changes to youth allowance eligibility criteria have just made this so much harder for many young people in regional Australia. There is no equality, there is no fairness in this.
That's right.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the restriction of access to youth allowance is having many detrimental effects on young people classified as living in inter-regional areas. There are many that are suffering as they feel, and rightly so, that an option has been removed from them. They are feeling isolated and guilty for putting pressure on their families to send them to university. Some families are having to make impossible decisions about which children to send to university. The provision of equal access to further education is fair and right, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a big issue for these students and should be a big issue for this Labor government. It is a big issue for the Coalition, and honourable members will be aware that the Social Security Amendment, Income Support for Regional Students Bill, introduced by Senator Fiona Nash, was passed in the Senate during last sitting period. Senator Nash reiterated the Coalition's position that, and I quote, regional students should have a fair and equitable access to education opportunities. The Labor-Greens coalition opposed this bill, whilst it was supported by Senators Nick Xenophon and Steve Fielding, who voted with the coalition. A Senate inquiry held into Social Security Amendment Income Support for Regional Students Bill 2010 recently received over 200 submissions and heard testimony from witnesses who overwhelmingly stated that the revised criteria for accessing of youth allowance by inter-regional students is unfair. Madam Deputy Speaker, these students and their families are asking for a hand up, not a handout. They want to be able to access university studies on some sort of equal basis as their metropolitan counterparts. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge all members to support this bill in the interest of fairness for all regional students.
Well done.